Hey there, Eli again, coming at you from Coventry here with another episode of Ecology with Eli. And today I wanted to take the chance to talk a little bit about what makes one individual organism or one species, one group of organisms differ from its close cousins and from other organisms. So today we're going to talk a little bit about speciation, what makes a species a species. For a quick definition, what even is a species? So when we're thinking of different animals, we can kind of categorize them in different terms, different families, different groupings. But at its core level, each type of individual species differ from their cousins in the fact that they are able to reproduce with one another. They share very common similar traits between one another, and they might be from the same locality as one another would be one of the best ways to put it. Now, taxonomically, a lot of scientists like to put big, long names on different animals. They like to group things into families, genuses, species. And this is really important for being able to distinguish exactly what species of animal you are looking at in comparison to another. However, in terms of the hobby, it's not necessarily as common, nor is it as necessary to exactly know what exact species you're dealing with. And the nomenclature, the taxonomy, maybe is not as important to the hobby itself. However, it is a cool thing to know about, and it's I find it quite interesting myself to kind of ascribe by some of these names that were given by scientists. However, a lot of times in the hobby, we're just looking at common names for different animals, so I'll try to keep it a little bit on the easier side for everybody. But generally, each species of organism on a taxonomic level is at least ascribed a genus and a species name. So when you think of Latin names, animals will come with their genus name, which includes some of their closest cousins. And then the species name would differentiate each individual type of species that has already been scientifically described. Anyway, without getting a little too in-depth on taxonomy, what kind of makes a species different from one another? What allows in the wild for animals to become different species? So we talked a little bit before about niches in the wild, niches, and these are basically the role that an individual type of organism fulfills in its wild environment, in its wild range. So wherever you place any of these animals that you see behind me, they will have a role that they play in the wild, and they have a very specific role that is often very specific to where they live in the wild. So a lot of times, from an evolutionary standpoint, a lot of these animals will differentiate in species. They will become different, unique species from one another, just based on geographical differences and having a wide variety of space between those. So if you take, for example, this purple tang, beautiful fish, this guy comes from the Red Sea, but he is a Zebrasoma species of tang, Zebrasoma being the genus. He looks very similar to, say, a yellow tang, a gem tang, black tang, Scopus tang, because they're all from the same Zebrasoma genus. However, they do differ in mainly just their color form. Body shape is going to be very similar. I mean, their size requirements are very similar between types, but the biggest difference is going to be the difference in pattern between these animals. But like I said earlier, this guy comes from the Red Sea and is only found in the wild in the Red Sea. Now that purple tang will differentiate from this Scopus tang that you see in front of me here for a couple different reasons. These are, like I just mentioned, both Zebrasoma species of tangs, so they are quite close cousins. Possibly even likely that hybridization could occur. These might even produce fertile offspring. I know a lot of you guys have probably seen the Yerful tang going around. That is a newer thing to the aquarium trade. That was a hybrid between a yellow and a purple tang. However, they do differ. They are individual species. And the biggest reason for this is that they actually had just a geographic difference between where they're found. So that purple tang is from the Red Sea, like I mentioned. The Scopus tang is more of an Indo-Pacific animal. These animals just kind of had enough time. They had a few thousand years apart from each other where they had distinct differences in where they occurred. And this just allowed for natural selection over time to allow for differences in behavior and differences in coloration and pattern between these two types of animals. And now we have two distinct species of tang. In the wild, they both fulfill very similar roles, so they both have a very similar niche. They are both algae grazers, and they do quite a good similar job at it. And in the wild, these guys both shoal, so these will occur in large groups that may somewhat exhibit a schooling pattern, but they will graze these rocks in the wild as a large group of tangs. And they kind of afford each other just enough space to get around, but they will form these small packs as they occur in the wild. To kind of apply that to aquariums, sometimes the Zebrasoma tangs are one of the easier tangs to get away with a small group in your aquarium. However, their behavior is going to differ when it comes to the bounds of an aquarium. So in the wild, these guys have pretty much a whole ocean to roam, so they don't feel as cramped for space. However, in an aquarium, sometimes these animals feel confined to a smaller water volume. This can kind of affect their mood in the tank. However, zebrosoma tangs are one of the easier animals to do so with if you decided to do so in a group. To give you guys some more examples of how tangs differ from each other, I've got an Acantharis tang up here, which is another genus. This is probably the most common genus of tangs known to man, but this tang here is called a lavender tang, and he has a different body shape than these guys do down here. He also has a very similar distribution to the Scopus tang, so it's possible in the wild that on some reefs these two do both occur in the same environment. However, these have had a long enough time to adapt to slightly different conditions that have allowed this animal to morphologically change its appearance to kind of suit its needs a little bit better. This tang gets a little bit larger. It also hunts in shoals, but it might be a little more pelagic. It might travel a little bit further than, say, your Scopus tang would. And this has allowed for it to kind of become its own species of fish in itself. And then this tank behind me, although he's being a little bit shy, I have yet another species of tang. This is also an Acantharis tang. So this is a close relative of the lavender tang. And in the wild, some of his distribution actually would overlap with that lavender tang. However, there are some huge behavior differences between this clown tang and the lavender tang. First and foremost, these clown tangs are brutally aggressive. They're one of the most aggressive tangs I've ever encountered. What's interesting about these tangs is they're actually one of the only tangs I really know about personally that is very much so a solo individual. So a lot of the other tangs I just showed you, as I mentioned, will form small schools, small groups. However, these clown tangs generally do not do so at all. And it's interesting reading up on these animals because a lot of times in the wild, they will claim a small territory of reef, which they will defend very viciously from any other, especially algae grazing competitors. So this tang really wants to be the only tang in his wild environment. And what's even neater about this tang is that they have been documented to actually manipulate their own environment to kind of make it easier for themselves to not have to travel to find food. So what's kind of neat about these tangs is when they occur on reefs that have acroporas or other stony corals, they are actually kind of known to trim up the edges of these coral colonies to keep them nice and compact so that there is more sunlight reaching the reef on the bottom of these coral colonies to afford themselves a little more algae growth in the area that they stake claim to, so that they can constantly feed off of this algae on the reef below them, which I just think is a really interesting thing about this fish. And because of this behavior, that has kind of fed into them being a little more aggressive and not tolerating their competitors as greatly as some of your other tank species would. So that kind of plays a role into the aquarium with these guys as well. So some of the differences I just highlighted between all these animals is kind of the big reason that they are different species from one another. Their wild environments over hundreds of thousands of years have allowed for this differentiation over a slow evolutionary period of time to become these different separate species from one another, regardless of how closely related they are to each other. So it's just really kind of an interesting thing to sit back and think about. Every single reef environment in the wild has different animals that live within it, and a lot of these are very close cousins. If I took the time today to show you goby species, I could go on forever and ever about the differences between different gobies. They happen to be one of the most diverse type of fish, as with wrasses, and it's just very interesting to see that there are different ways which these animals can start to form these differences, whether it be a physical barrier like those zebrosoma tangs I showed you, with there being an actual geographic difference between the two animals, or whether they just have different personalities or different niches that they fulfill in the environment, like that lavender tang versus the clown tang that I just showed you, where these animals developed their own methods of interacting with their environment, and these have allowed for them to differentiate over thousands of years. Whereas it may not be terribly important to know why exactly different animals are different from one another, it's definitely important when you get into stocking your own aquarium that you take some of these differences into account. So when we're dealing with some of those species, like I just mentioned, aggression can be a really big difference between some of these species, and some species just really are not compatible with others for that exact reason. Additionally, some species may not really encounter each other in the wild, whereas you can keep like a purple tang with Scopus and yellow tang. In the wild, this would never really occur. It's not very likely for that to happen. So it is worth noting that that might not be something that's easy to pull off in an aquarium, and it may be kind of a dangerous feat. So it's always important to keep that sort of thing in mind when you're planning stocking out your aquarium. As always, appreciate you guys sticking around with me while we talk a little bit about speciation today. Let me know in the comment section below if you have questions or suggestions for future videos. And as always, keep on reefing.